I'm Brandy Schillace, and I'm the author of Mr. Humble and Dr. Butcher, a Pope's neuroscientist, a monkey's head. It's about head transplant. I know that seems a little bit out there, but in fact, it's all true. I feel like the best way to introduce this is to tell you how I was introduced to the entire story. I have a friend who happens to be a neurosurgeon, and he works a lot in trauma and brain death, and I encountered him while I was writing another book on death and dying. And one day, he called me to his office and asked me if I would come down. There was something interesting he wanted to show me. That's a pretty good invitation. So down I went. I was on Case Western's campus, and I popped into his office, and he hands me a shoebox, which I wasn't really expecting. He pushes it across the desk towards me, and I think I made some kind of joking comment like, "There's not a brain in there, right?" To which he replied, "Not exactly." I opened it up to find an old notebook from the 1950s. It's well-worn, it's dog-eared, and flipping through it, I can see all sorts of notes in cramped handwriting and pasted-in ideas and charts and little rusty flecks, which turn out to be dried blood. I'm confused about what I'm looking at, and I say to Michael DeGiorgia, "What is this? What is this in my hands?" And he responded with the strangest sentence I've ever heard. He said, "That is the lab notebook of Dr. Robert White, the first person to successfully transplant a primate head in 1971. There's a lot in there to get your head around, not to pun on purpose, but it's true. A head transplant, and a successful one, and in the 1970s? I had to know more. I was completely hooked. So I started following this story. And while it is a biography of Dr. Robert White, many people in Cleveland probably know of him, it's also the tale of 50 years of medicine and change in the way we look at ethics, the way we look at life, the way we look at death, the way we look at organ transplant. And so much of this begins in the 1940s, progresses through the Cold War era, a real fight between sides about who was going to transplant organs first and what could really be done. Ultimately, it leads not just to the head transplant, which you might think is the most startling thing in this book. It's not. But also to life-saving techniques that we still use today. Surgery protocols, therapeutic hypothermia. Dr. Robert White's life intersects with so many things that changed in our culture in the United States and in the world. You have the civil rights movement. You have the animal rights movement. You have the changing relationships between ourselves and other countries. Remember, this has begun so long ago in the 1940s that we've only just gotten out of World War II. And yet the book follows this story of medicine and pushing the edges of science all the way into the 2000s and the new millennium. Dr. Robert White's chief goal was to save lives. That's what he really wanted to do. He was a surgeon, but he was also a scientist. And in fact, that's why he came to Cleveland in the first place. He wanted to be both a surgeon and a scientist, and Cleveland, Metro, was the one place that let him do both of those things. But Dr. White had two sides to his personality in another way, too. He was Catholic, deeply faithful, very much somebody who felt that he was God-directed and that his goal in life was to save people for God. That's why he called himself Mr. Humble. A little tongue-in-cheek, probably. But he was also someone who pushed the edges, who wanted to ask hard questions about who we are and where we are. Do we reside entirely in our brains? Are we brains on legs? Is everything about you, your personality, your whole self, really just upstairs? And if so, what would it mean for a brain to outlive its body? What would it mean if we could, in Dr. White's words, transplant the human soul? That becomes his mission. He wants to perform the first human head transplant. And that's a little bit difficult to get your mind around. But let's break it down. There's a few things that we're quite familiar with today that in their time were very, very strange. I don't think we appreciate just how weird organ transplant is. We're used to it now. We tick boxes on our driver's license applications. We know people's lives can be saved by a kidney, by a liver, a lung, a heart. But think about the fact that none of that could have happened until the 1950s. And even then, the very first successful organ transplant, which was a kidney, only worked because it had been performed on identical twins at the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital in Boston by Nobel Prize winner Joseph Murray. Now, that first kidney transplant had everyone quite worried on the team. If they made a mistake there, it could set back organ transplant for decades. But it was successful. It worked. And it just so happened that a young medical student was also in Boston at that time, working in the same close confines, Dr. Robert White. When he saw that first kidney transplant, he thought, well, there's no limit. We could transplant so many other organs. We could save so many lives. But what if you needed all the organs? What if you had a perfectly good mind? You were still very much alive inside and had much to give the world with your brain, but your body was failing. He liked to use Stephen Hawking as an example of someone who had so much to give, but whose body had become dependent on life support and systems, machinery. Wouldn't you want to give them an organ transplant that involved all the organs? A body transplant? Or, to look at it another way, a head transplant? It seems far-fetched. It seems like Frankenstein. And in fact, Dr. White's favorite book, he loved Frankenstein. He thought that pushing those boundaries to save human lives was worth it. Not everyone agreed. Let's face it, there's some really scary things about the idea that you can take your head and move it somewhere else. Maybe that's the most surprising thing in the story. What happens if you exist beyond the body that you're traveling around in? These are philosophical questions about who we are and who we want to be. It turns out that isolating the human brain and keeping it alive was one of the first things Dr. White did. It's early in the book. It's early in this timeline. He was able to prove that the brain can technically live outside its body, particularly if you cool it down so it's not so greedy, because it is a greedy organ. Deprived of oxygen, the cells die off. You suffer brain damage and ultimately death. And brain death is a concept that I had to grapple with for this book too. Did you know that we still don't really have a single, fully accepted medical definition of death? We know what death is once we're sure that it's death, and we know what life looks like, but that ephemeral, muddy moment in between, when you cease to be a living thing, that's much harder to pinpoint. And in fact, even today, brain death is really a criteria, a list of checkboxes. Is there an isoelectric or flatline EEG? Are the responses stopped? Has the body stopped breathing on its own? But your heart can still beat. That's because the heart's part of the autonomic system. The heart can beat even after brain death. So prior to us having artificial respiration, usually brain death almost immediately led to death because there wasn't any oxygen being pumped through the lungs. However, once we began artificial respiration, it meant we could keep brain-dead bodies alive, bodies who had beating hearts but were never going to wake up. And doctors had to ask, what does that mean? Is this body dead? Is this person dead? And in the age of transplants, is this body harvestable? Can you take the organs? I mention this because throughout this period of 50 years, medicine is grappling with real ethical questions about that line between life and death. Dr. White is asking those questions too, but kind of from the other direction. Not what happens when the body dies, or not what happens when the brain dies and the body lives on, but what happens when the brain lives on and the body itself has died. These are two halves of the same murky question. And once you start transplanting organs and having to make these decisions, can we take the organs now? Are you dead enough? That opens up a whole new world for ethics, for bioethics. And in fact, Dr. White helped to establish the Vatican Council for Bioethics and was friends with 2 different popes. This is a bit shocking because so much in Dr. White's life that I heard about I kept thinking were rumors. Well, okay, he knew a pope. No, he knew 2 popes. Oh, well, he tried to isolate a brain. No, he succeeded. Well, there seemed to be no end to the adventures that he went on. And that's not the only thing going on in this text. He was a family man. He had 10 children. He lived in Shaker Heights. He mixed among everyone else in Cleveland. He had a favorite diner where he got coffee and where he often served patrons and told them that he worked there because having 10 kids was expensive. This is a story about one man's quest to transplant a soul. But it's also a story about a man with 2 sides of self. And aren't we all complex, composite beings in that way? He was called Mr. Butcher by PETA, by animal rights groups who thought he shouldn't be doing the experiments he did. And instead of being, moved to stop doing those experiments, he instead debated animal rights activists. He stood up and said, "You want to call me Dr. Butcher, but I'm saving children's lives." He never doubted for a moment that he was on the right track, even if some of his friends, colleagues, and certainly his adversaries thought he was doing wrong. It's a story about wondering where the line not just between life and death is, but between right and wrong, and between can and should. As science moves in these ever increasingly complex directions, as technology takes off, and we're able to do more and more amazing things, even to the point of new prosthetics and trying to skip spinal injuries to motivate the body after injury, we have to ask a lot of questions. We know we can transplant organs to save lives, but we have to know that we're doing it ethically. We think we know, when life ends. We have to make sure. So often, science moves at the speed of experience, and it's faster than our ability to comprehend the consequences. I hope that you walk away from this book not only with an idea of adventure, of what it was like to be doing these things in Cold War era science, to be competing with colleagues across the globe, but also to see what it's like to be a single human being grappling with really difficult questions during a time period when everything around you is changing. Because after all, isn't that the position we're all in right now, all the time, in this new technological and digital age? So I hope that you'll read Mr. Humble and Dr. Butcher, that you'll get to know Dr. White better, and that you'll ask yourself really hard questions about what it means to be human and what it means to be living in this strange reality where we are brain and body, material and essence, where we are human beings looking for ways forward into the medical future.